In the harsh frontier town of Millbrook, Kansas in 1878, young Eliza Hartford faces a desperate choice: remain in the overcrowded orphanage until she's cast out at 18, or accept a marriage proposal from Samuel Whitlock, a widowed rancher still mourning his late wife. Both enter this arrangement with practical intentions. She seeks security and freedom, while he needs help managing his household and caring for his young daughter Lucy. However, Samuel's heart remains locked away, hardened by grief and the betrayals of his past. Everything changes when Eliza's beautiful singing voice begins to heal, not only the silent sorrow that has consumed their home, but also Samuel's wounded soul. Through music, faith, and unexpected love, they discover that sometimes the most practical arrangements can bloom into the most extraordinary romances. The autumn wind of 1878 cut through the thin walls of the Millbrook orphanage like a blade, carrying with it the scent of dying leaves and the promise of another harsh Kansas winter. Eliza Hartford pressed her face against the frost-kissed window of the dormitory, watching the townspeople hurry past in their thick coats and warm scarves. At 17, she was one of the oldest residents, and every day brought her closer to the dreaded 18th birthday that would force her onto the streets with nothing but the worn dress on her back and whatever meager skills she had managed to acquire. The orphanage, once a grand Victorian home belonging to a wealthy merchant family, now housed 43 children in spaces meant for perhaps half that number. The wallpaper peeled in long strips, revealing water-stained plaster beneath, and the floorboards creaked ominously under the weight of so many small feet. Mrs. Thornton, the stern matron who ran the establishment with an iron fist and a perpetually sour expression, made it clear that charity had its limits, and those limits ended precisely on one's 18th birthday. Eliza had arrived at the orphanage 12 years earlier, a frightened 5-year-old whose parents had perished in a cholera outbreak that swept through their small farming community. She remembered little of her life before the orphanage: fragments of her mother's gentle voice singing lullabies, the rough texture of her father's work-worn hands, the warmth of a kitchen filled with the aroma of fresh bread. These memories felt more like dreams now, faded and insubstantial, leaving her with only questions about who she might have been in a different life. The younger children looked up to Eliza with a mixture of admiration and fear. She was tall for a woman, nearly 5 feet and 7 inches, with auburn hair that caught the light like burnished copper, and green eyes that seemed to hold depths of understanding beyond her years. Her hands, calloused from years of kitchen work and mending, were surprisingly graceful when she helped the little ones with their letters or soothed their nightmares with soft-spoken stories. But it was her voice that truly set her apart, a clear, pure soprano that could transform even the most mundane hymn into something approaching the divine. Mrs. Thornton had long since given up trying to silence Eliza's singing during the evening prayers. The first time she had tried, the other children had wept so pitifully that even the matron's stony heart had been moved to reluctant compromise. Now, as autumn deepened into winter, Eliza's voice provided the only warmth in the cold, overcrowded rooms where children huddled together for comfort and dreamed of families that would never come for them. On this particular morning, Mrs. Thornton's heavy footsteps echoed through the hallway, accompanied by the lighter tread of an unfamiliar visitor. Eliza had been helping the youngest children with their morning wash when the sound reached her ears, and something in the deliberate pace of those footsteps made her pause, washcloth dripping in her hand. "Miss Hartford," Mrs. Thornton's voice cracked like a whip from the doorway. "You have a visitor in the parlor. Make yourself presentable immediately." Eliza's heart began to race as she followed the matron down the narrow hallway, past the dining room where the smell of watery porridge still lingered, past the common room where older children sat mending clothes with fingers numbed by cold. The parlor, reserved for the rare occasions when prospective adoptive families came to call, felt foreign and formal with its stiff-backed chairs and faded carpet that had once been grand. Standing near the window was a man she had never seen before, though his presence seemed to fill the small room entirely. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that showed streaks of premature silver at the temples and lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting against the prairie sun. His clothes were well-made but practical: dark wool trousers, a white cotton shirt, and a leather vest that bore the subtle marks of honest work. There was something about his stillness that reminded Eliza of a wild animal, pausing to assess potential danger, and when he turned to face her, she found herself looking into the most sorrowful brown eyes she had ever seen. "Miss Hartford," Mrs. Thornton began, her voice taking on the false sweetness she reserved for potential benefactors, "this is Mr. Samuel Whitlock. He owns the Whitlock Ranch about 15 miles south of town, and he has come with a proposition that might interest you. Samuel Whitlock studied Eliza with an intensity that made her want to smooth down her hair and check that her apron was properly tied. She had heard his name mentioned in town, whispered conversations about the young rancher who had lost his wife in childbirth 3 years earlier and had become something of a hermit since then, rarely coming to town except for necessary supplies and never participating in the social gatherings that formed the backbone of frontier community life. "Miss Hartford," he said, and his voice was deeper than she had expected, roughened by years of calling commands across wide pastures and speaking mainly to horses and cattle. "Mrs. Thornton tells me you'll be 18 come spring." "Yes, sir. In April." Eliza's own voice sounded strange to her ears, higher and more breathless than usual. "And you understand what that means for your situation here?" The bluntness of the question might have seemed cruel from another man, but something in Samuel Whitlock's manner suggested he was simply someone who preferred plain speaking to pretty lies. "Yes, sir. I'll need to find employment and lodging elsewhere." He nodded slowly, as if her answer confirmed something he had already suspected. "I have a proposition for you, Miss Hartford. It's not romantic, and it's not based on any tender feelings between us, so I want you to understand that from the beginning. I need a wife, not for companionship, but for practical reasons. I have a young daughter who needs a woman's care, and my ranch requires more work than I can manage alone. In return, I can offer you a home, security, and a name that carries respect in this community." The silence that followed his words seemed to stretch for an eternity. Eliza felt as though the floor had shifted beneath her feet, leaving her struggling to maintain her balance in a world that had suddenly become unfamiliar. Marriage. The word echoed in her mind like a church bell, heavy with implications she couldn't fully grasp. "I know it's not what young women dream of," Samuel continued, his gaze never leaving her face. "But dreams are luxuries that people like us can't always afford. I'm offering you a chance at a decent life, Miss Hartford. The choice is yours." Mrs. Thornton cleared her throat meaningfully. "Perhaps you'd like some time to consider Mr. Whitlock's generous offer, Eliza." But Eliza found herself shaking her head before she had fully processed the decision. "No, ma'am. I don't need time to think about it." She looked directly at Samuel Whitlock, meeting those sorrowful brown eyes with a steadiness that surprised them both. "I accept your proposition, Mr. Whitlock." Something flickered across his features. Surprise, perhaps, or relief, but it was gone so quickly she might have imagined it. "Very well. We'll be married next Saturday at the church. I'll speak with Reverend Mitchell today and make the arrangements. You should pack whatever belongings you have." "I don't have much," Eliza admitted, thinking of the single change of clothes and few personal items that constituted her entire worldly possessions. "That's fine. We'll get you what you need." Samuel turned toward the door, then paused. "One more thing, Miss Hartford. I want you to understand that this is a business arrangement. I'm not looking for love or romance. I had that once and it died with my wife. I'm offering you security and respect, but I can't offer you my heart. I want to be clear about that before we proceed." Eliza nodded, though something deep in her chest twisted painfully at his words. "I understand, Mr. Whitlock. I'm not expecting fairy tales." He studied her face for a long moment, as if trying to read some hidden message there. "Good. I'll return Saturday morning to escort you to the church." After he left, the parlor felt strangely empty, as though his presence had been the only thing giving the room substance. Mrs. Thornton bustled about, offering congratulations that sounded more relieved than joyful, already calculating how much easier it would be to manage the orphanage with one less mouth to feed. But Eliza remained standing by the window where Samuel Whitlock had first appeared, watching the empty street and wondering what she had just agreed to. She thought of the younger children upstairs, of the cold dormitory and the uncertain future that awaited her in just a few months. Then she thought of the man who had just offered her an escape, his sad eyes and careful words, the way he had stood so still and watchful, like someone who had learned not to expect good things from life. As she finally turned away from the window, Eliza found herself humming softly under her breath, an old melody her mother had sung to her so many years ago. It was a song about hope and new beginnings, about the courage to step forward into an unknown future. She didn't know what awaited her at the Whitlock Ranch, but for the first time in months, she felt something other than despair settling in her chest. Like this video if you're enjoying Eliza's journey. Subscribe for more heartwarming frontier stories, and comment below to let us know where you're watching from. Saturday morning arrived with a clarity that seemed almost cruel in its perfection. The Kansas sky stretched endlessly blue above Millbrook, unmarked by even a single cloud, and the autumn air carried a crispness that promised winter was still weeks away. Eliza stood before the cracked mirror in the orphanage washroom, attempting to arrange her auburn hair into something resembling respectability. The dress she wore, her only good dress, was a simple gray wool that Mrs. Thornton had grudgingly allowed her to keep when it had grown too small for one of the other girls. It had been mended so many times that the original fabric was barely visible beneath the careful patches, but it was clean and modest, which would have to suffice for a wedding that was, by all accounts, merely a legal formality. The other children had gathered in the hallway to see her off, their faces a mixture of excitement and bewilderment. Marriage was a concept as foreign to most of them as exotic travel, something that happened to other people in other worlds. Little Mary, barely 6 years old, tugged at Eliza's skirt with tears streaming down her face. "Will you come back and visit us?" she whispered, her voice thick with the kind of grief that children experience when their world shifts beyond recognition. Eliza knelt down to Mary's level, gently wiping the tears from the little girl's cheeks. "I don't know, sweetheart, but I want you to remember that just because I'm leaving doesn't mean I'll forget you. And someday when you're older, maybe you'll have a chance for a new beginning too." Mrs. Thornton's sharp voice cut through the tender moment. "Mr. Whitlock has arrived, Eliza. Don't keep him waiting." Samuel stood in the parlor exactly as he had 5 days earlier, wearing the same practical clothes but with the addition of a dark jacket that marked the occasion as something more formal than a business meeting. His hair had been recently cut, and she could detect the faint scent of bay rum, suggesting he had made some effort to prepare for the day. When he saw her, something almost like approval flickered across his features. "You look well, Miss Hartford," he said simply. "Are you ready?" Eliza nodded, clutching the small bundle that contained everything she owned in the world. As they walked toward the church, their footsteps echoing on the wooden sidewalk, she found herself stealing glances at the man who would soon be her husband. His profile was strong and weathered, with lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent outdoors under the harsh prairie sun. There was something almost military in his bearing, a straightness to his spine and economy of movement that suggested discipline and self-control. The Millbrook Community Church was a modest white building with a simple steeple, built by the town's founding families with more hope than money. Inside, the wooden pews stood nearly empty except for Mrs. Thornton, who had come as a witness, and an elderly woman Eliza didn't recognize who sat in the front row with a small girl beside her. Reverend Mitchell, a kind-faced man in his 50s who had baptized most of the children in town, greeted them with gentle solemnity. He had known Samuel since childhood and had officiated at his first wedding, which lent a certain weight to his demeanor as he prepared to perform this very different ceremony. "Samuel, Miss Hartford," he began, his voice carrying easily through the small space. "Marriage is a sacred covenant, whether entered into for love or for practical necessity. The vows you speak today will bind you before God and man, and I trust you both understand the gravity of that commitment." The ceremony itself was brief and businesslike. Samuel's responses came in a steady, measured tone that revealed nothing of his inner thoughts, while Eliza found her own voice surprisingly clear as she repeated the ancient words that would transform her from orphan to wife in the space of a few minutes. When Reverend Mitchell pronounced them husband and wife, Samuel turned to her with the same careful neutrality he had maintained throughout their brief acquaintance, offering her his arm as they walked back down the aisle. The elderly woman who had witnessed the ceremony proved to be Mrs. Patterson, Samuel's nearest neighbor and the woman who had been caring for his daughter during his absence. She was a sturdy, practical woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun and intelligent blue eyes that seemed to take Eliza's measure in a single glance. "So you're the young woman who's agreed to take on Samuel and little Lucy," she said without preamble as they stood outside the church. "I hope you know what you're getting yourself into, child." The little girl hiding behind Mrs. Patterson's skirts was perhaps 5 years old, with her father's dark hair and eyes that held a wariness far beyond her years. When Samuel knelt down to her level, his entire demeanor softened in a way that transformed his face completely. "Lucy, sweetheart, I want you to meet Miss Eliza. She's going to be living with us now, helping to take care of you and our home." Lucy studied Eliza with the intense scrutiny that only children can manage, her small face serious and unsmiling. "Is she going to be my new mama?" The question hung in the air like smoke, heavy with implications that none of the adults seemed prepared to address directly. Samuel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and Eliza felt her heart squeeze painfully in her chest. "She's going to be my wife," Samuel said carefully, "which means she'll be living in our house and helping to look after you. But you don't have to call her anything you don't want to, Lucy. That's up to you. The wagon ride to the Whitlock Ranch took nearly 2 hours, following a rutted dirt road that stretched through rolling prairie grassland, dotted with cattle and occasional stands of cottonwood trees. Lucy sat between them on the wagon seat, chattering occasionally about her dolls or the kittens in the barn, but her natural childish exuberance was tempered by frequent glances at Eliza, as if trying to determine whether this new addition to her small world represented safety or threat. Samuel drove in comfortable silence, his attention focused on the team of sturdy bay horses that pulled the wagon with steady determination. Occasionally he would point out landmarks, the creek where they got their water during dry spells, the pasture where he kept his prize breeding stock, the line of trees that marked the boundary with the Patterson spread. His voice when he spoke was matter-of-fact, like a man showing a new employee around a workplace rather than bringing home a bride. The ranch itself, when it finally came into view, was larger and more prosperous-looking than Eliza had expected. The house was a solid 2-story structure built of local limestone, with a wide front porch and green shutters that spoke of a woman's touch in their design. The barn and outbuildings were well maintained, and the corrals held several dozen head of healthy-looking cattle. It was clear that Samuel Whitlock, whatever his personal sorrows, was a successful rancher who took pride in his land and livestock. "It's beautiful," Eliza said, and meant it. After 12 years in the crowded, shabby orphanage, the wide-open spaces and clean lines of the ranch building seemed like something from a dream. Samuel glanced at her, perhaps surprised by the genuine admiration in her voice. "My father built the house when he first claimed this land. He always said a man's home should reflect his hopes for the future, not just his current circumstances." As they approached the house, Lucy suddenly came alive with excitement. "Can I show her the kittens, Papa? And my room? And the piano?" "Piano?" Eliza turned to look at Samuel in surprise. His expression had closed off again, becoming carefully neutral. "My first wife played. The instrument hasn't been touched since—" He cleared his throat. "Lucy, why don't you help Mrs. Eliza get settled first? Then you can show her whatever you like." The interior of the house was as well appointed as the exterior suggested, with solid furniture and fixtures that spoke of both quality and care. The parlor held a beautiful upright piano, its mahogany surface dusty from disuse, and family photographs in silver frames that Eliza tried not to study too closely. Everything was clean but had an air of careful preservation, as if the house had been frozen in time 3 years ago, and no one had quite figured out how to move forward. Lucy's room was a little girl's paradise, with a 4-poster bed, shelves lined with dolls and books, and a rocking horse by the window that had clearly been crafted with love and skill. The child threw herself onto the bed with unconscious grace, then looked up at Eliza with suddenly shy eyes. "Do you like children?" she asked, the question carrying more weight than its simple words suggested. Eliza sat carefully on the edge of the bed, smoothing her skirts. "I do. I've spent most of my life around children, actually. At the orphanage where I lived, I helped take care of the younger ones." "Were you an orphan too?" Lucy's voice was very small. "Yes, sweetheart. My parents died when I was about your age." Lucy considered this information with the seriousness that children bring to matters of life and death. "My mama died too. Papa says she went to heaven, but I don't understand why she couldn't take me with her." The simple honesty of the statement hit Eliza like a physical blow. She found herself reaching out instinctively to smooth Lucy's dark hair, surprised when the little girl didn't pull away from her touch. "Sometimes grown-ups have to go places that children can't follow yet," Eliza said gently. "But that doesn't mean they stop loving us, it just means we have to learn how to carry that love with us while we wait." From downstairs came the sound of Samuel's boots on the wooden floors, and his voice calling for them to come down for dinner. As they made their way to the dining room, Eliza caught sight of herself in a hallway mirror and was startled by what she saw. The young woman looking back at her no longer wore the gray orphanage dress. She was Mrs. Samuel Whitlock now, mistress of this house and stepmother to the solemn little girl walking beside her. The realization should have been terrifying, but instead, as Lucy slipped her small hand into Eliza's larger one, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years. The sensation of belonging somewhere, of being needed and wanted for who she was rather than tolerated as an obligation. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was hope. And after so many years of uncertainty, hope felt like the most precious gift she could imagine. The first week of married life passed in a careful dance of adjustment and unspoken boundaries. Eliza threw herself into learning the rhythms of ranch life, with the determination of someone who understood that her success here meant the difference between security and destitution. She rose before dawn to start the fires and prepare breakfast, spending her days mastering the intricacies of managing a household that was far more complex than anything she had experienced at the orphanage. Samuel proved to be a patient teacher when it came to practical matters. He showed her where supplies were kept, explained the schedule that governed meals for the ranch hands who worked the cattle, and demonstrated the operation of the cast-iron stove that dominated the kitchen like a temperamental beast requiring constant attention. His instructions were clear and methodical, delivered in the same measured tone he used for everything else, but she caught him watching her sometimes with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. Lucy became her shadow during those first days, following her from room to room with the intensity of a child desperate to understand whether this new presence in her life represented stability or another loss waiting to happen. The little girl would sit on a kitchen stool while Eliza worked, chattering about her dolls or asking endless questions about life at the orphanage, but always keeping herself close enough to touch if needed. It was on the third morning that Eliza first encountered the piano. She had been dusting the parlor while Lucy played nearby with a collection of wooden horses that Samuel had carved for her, when her cloth brushed against the keys, producing a discordant sound that made them both freeze. Lucy's head snapped up from her toys, her dark eyes suddenly wide with something that might have been fear. "Papa doesn't like it when people touch the piano," she whispered. It was Mama's special thing. Eliza felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment and quickly stepped away from the instrument. "I'm sorry, sweetheart. I didn't mean to disturb anything." But the damage was already done. When Samuel came in from the barn an hour later, Lucy ran to him with the breathless urgency of a child reporting a crisis. "Papa," the new lady touched Mama's piano. The transformation in Samuel's face was immediate and stark. The careful neutrality he had maintained since their wedding disappeared, replaced by something raw and angry that made Eliza take an involuntary step backward. For a moment, she saw him as he must have been in those first dark months after his wife's death, a man consumed by grief and rage at the unfairness of life. "The piano is not to be touched," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "That room is to be dusted around the instrument, never on it. Is that understood?" "Yes, sir," Eliza managed, her voice barely audible. "I apologize. It was an accident." He stared at her for a long moment, and she could see him fighting to regain control over emotions that clearly still had the power to overwhelm him. When he spoke again, his tone was carefully modulated once more, but she could hear the effort it cost him. "Rebecca was gifted. The piano was her greatest joy. I will not have it treated carelessly." The name hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Rebecca, his first wife, the woman whose memory still governed this house like an invisible spirit. Eliza nodded silently, understanding that she had just learned one of the fundamental rules of her new existence. She was welcome here as a caretaker and helpmate, but she must never presume to touch the sacred spaces that belonged to the dead. That evening, after Lucy had been put to bed and the house had settled into the quiet rhythms of nighttime, Eliza found herself alone in the kitchen washing the dinner dishes. Through the window, she could see Samuel checking on the horses in the corral, his lantern casting a warm circle of light in the darkness. The sight of him moving through his evening routines with mechanical precision struck her as profoundly lonely, and for the first time since arriving at the ranch, she found herself humming softly, an old hymn her mother had sung to her before the fever took both parents and left her an orphan. The melody seemed to fill the empty spaces in the kitchen, warming the room in a way that had nothing to do with the fire in the stove. She had always found comfort in music, though at the orphanage there had been little opportunity for anything beyond the Sunday hymns that Mrs. Thornton grudgingly allowed during chapel services. Her voice had been her secret refuge, the one thing that belonged entirely to her in a world where orphans owned nothing. She didn't realize she had begun singing the words aloud until she heard the kitchen door open behind her. Samuel stood in the doorway, his hand still on the latch, staring at her with an expression of such shock that she immediately fell silent. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I didn't mean to disturb." "Don't stop." His voice was hoarse, almost unrecognizable. "Please." She turned to face him fully, water still dripping from her hands, and saw something in his eyes that made her heart skip. It wasn't anger this time, but something more complex. Pain and longing and a kind of desperate hunger that spoke of a man who had been starving for something he couldn't name. "It's just an old hymn," she said softly. "My mother used to sing it to me." "Rebecca sang," he said, the words seeming to tear themselves from his throat. "Every morning while she worked, every evening while she sewed. The house has been silent since—" He stopped, visibly struggling with the admission. Eliza set down the dish she had been washing and dried her hands slowly, giving him time to decide whether he wanted to continue. When he remained silent, she made a choice that surprised them both. "Would you like me to finish the song?" He nodded without speaking, moving to lean against the kitchen table as if he needed the support. She began again, her voice soft and sweet, filling the room with a melody that spoke of comfort and peace, and the kind of faith that sustained people through their darkest hours. As she sang, she watched his face transform, the hard lines around his eyes softening as some of the tension he carried like armor began to ease. When the last note faded, they stood in silence for a long moment. Finally, Samuel cleared his throat and straightened, his mask of composure sliding back into place, though not quite as completely as before. "Lucy should be asleep," he said, his voice roughly normal again. "Morning comes early." It was a dismissal, but not an unkind one, and Eliza understood that she had just witnessed something he had not intended to share. As she finished cleaning the kitchen and made her way upstairs to the small room that had become hers, she found herself thinking about the man she had married, and the depths of grief that still clearly haunted him. Her room was simply furnished, but comfortable, with a window that looked out over the rolling prairie and a small writing desk where she had placed the few personal items she owned. Among them was a worn songbook that had belonged to her mother, filled with hymns and folk songs that represented the only inheritance she had received from her former life. As she prepared for bed, she found herself wondering whether music might be the key to understanding Samuel Whitlock, not just the successful rancher and devoted father that he showed to the world, but the wounded man underneath who had loved his first wife so completely that her death had left him hollow. The next morning brought an unexpected revelation. Lucy appeared at breakfast with red-rimmed eyes and a defiant expression that reminded Eliza powerfully of her father. "I had a bad dream," she announced without preamble. "Mama was trying to talk to me, but I couldn't hear her because the house was too quiet." Samuel's face went pale, but before he could respond, Lucy turned to Eliza with the desperate earnestness of a child who has made an important decision. "Will you sing again tonight? Before bedtime? Mama used to sing to me, and maybe if there's music in the house again, she'll be able to find her way to my dreams properly." The request hung between them like a bridge over troubled water. Eliza looked at Samuel, searching his face for guidance, but found only the same struggle between grief and longing that she had witnessed the night before. Finally, she made a decision that felt like stepping off a cliff into unknown territory. "If your papa agrees, I'd be happy to sing for you," she said gently. Samuel's eyes met hers across the breakfast table, and in that moment she saw something shift in his expression. Not love, not yet, but perhaps the first tentative acknowledgement that the woman he had married for practical reasons might offer something he hadn't expected to find again. The faintest shadow of a smile touched his lips as he nodded his consent, and Eliza felt her heart lift with the possibility that this arrangement might become something more than a simple exchange of services after all. The ritual began that very evening. After supper was cleared and Lucy had changed into her nightgown, the three of them gathered in the parlor, carefully avoiding the piano that stood like a shrine in the corner, while Eliza sang soft lullabies and gentle hymns. Her voice seemed to weave a spell over the room, transforming the formal space into something warmer and more intimate than it had been since Rebecca's death. Lucy would curl up in her father's lap, her small fingers playing with the buttons on his shirt while Eliza's melodies wrapped around them like a comforting blanket. Samuel remained stiff at first, his arms around his daughter but his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the walls, as if he were afraid that allowing himself to truly listen would open floodgates he wasn't prepared to handle. But gradually, night after night, Eliza watched the tension leave his shoulders and saw him begin to close his eyes, letting the music wash over him with something approaching peace. The transformation didn't happen all at once. There were setbacks, mornings when Samuel would retreat behind his walls of politeness, days when the weight of his grief seemed too heavy for even Eliza's gentle presence to lift. But there were also small victories. The evening he unconsciously began humming along with one of her songs. The morning he complimented her biscuits without being asked. The afternoon she found him teaching Lucy a rope trick while actually smiling. It was in the third week of their marriage that everything changed. Eliza had been hanging laundry behind the house when she heard Lucy crying inside. Not the ordinary tears of a scraped knee or a broken toy, but the deep, inconsolable sobs of a child whose heart had been broken anew. She dropped the wet sheets and ran inside to find the little girl standing in the parlor, staring at the piano with devastation written across her face. "I can't remember it anymore," Lucy wailed when Eliza knelt beside her. "I can't remember how Mama's music sounded. I try and try, but it's getting fuzzy in my head. and Papa won't let anybody play her songs, and what if I forget her completely? The words hit Eliza like a physical blow. She had lost her own parents at a young age and understood the terror of feeling memories slip away like water through cupped hands. Without conscious thought, she rose and moved toward the piano, her fingers trembling as they hovered over the keys. "Eliza, no." Samuel's voice cut through the room like a blade. He stood in the doorway, having come running at the sound of his daughter's distress, and his face was a mask of fury and panic. "I told you. She's forgetting her mother's music," Eliza said quietly, not turning around. "Lucy is losing the sound of Rebecca's voice, and you're so busy protecting the memory that you're letting the living child suffer for it." The accusation hung between them like a gauntlet thrown down. Samuel's face went white, and for a moment she thought he might physically remove her from the room. But then Lucy spoke, her voice small and broken with longing. "Please, Papa, just one song, just so I can remember." The silence that followed seemed to stretch for an eternity. Eliza could hear her own heartbeat, could feel the weight of the decision balanced on a knife's edge. Finally, without looking at her husband, she pressed down on middle C, the clear note ringing through the room like a bell. Samuel made a sound, half gasp, half sob, but he didn't stop her. Encouraged, Eliza began to play a simple melody, something gentle and familiar that might have been one of the hymns from her childhood. Her fingers found their way across the keys with surprising sureness, muscle memory awakening from years of secret practice on the orphanage's battered upright piano when Mrs. Thornton wasn't watching. As the music filled the room, Lucy's sobs gradually quieted. She moved closer to the piano, her small hands pressing against the polished wood, as if she could absorb the vibrations directly into her skin. When Eliza began to sing, a lullaby about angels watching over sleeping children, Lucy's face transformed with wonder and recognition. "That's one Mama used to sing," she whispered. "I remember now. She would play it when I was scared." Eliza glanced over her shoulder and saw Samuel still standing frozen in the doorway, tears streaming down his face unchecked. But it wasn't the angry grief she had seen before. This was something rawer and more healing, the kind of weeping that comes when a dam finally breaks and allows the poison to drain away. She finished the lullaby and began another, then another, each song seeming to unlock more memories for Lucy and tear down more barriers in Samuel's carefully constructed defenses. When she finally let her hands fall to her lap, the room felt different, lighter somehow, as if a weight that had been pressing down on all of them had finally been lifted. Lucy climbed onto the piano bench beside her, pressing close with the trust of a child who had found someone willing to help her remember, rather than forcing her to forget. "Will you teach me to play Mama's songs?" she asked eagerly, "so I can keep them alive forever and ever?" "If your Papa agrees," Eliza said softly, still not daring to look at Samuel directly. She heard footsteps crossing the room, felt rather than saw him approach the piano. When she finally gathered the courage to meet his eyes, she found something there that took her breath away. The walls were down, the careful distance he had maintained since their wedding completely abandoned, and in their place was a vulnerability so complete it made her heart ache. "Rebecca would have wanted the music to continue," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "She always said that songs were meant to be shared, not hoarded like treasures in a vault. I was so afraid of losing her memory that I almost lost what mattered most about it." He moved closer, his hand coming to rest on Lucy's shoulder while his eyes remained fixed on Eliza's face. "I married you because I thought I needed someone to take care of practical things," he continued. "I thought I could keep my heart locked away and still somehow provide what my daughter needed. But you," he paused, struggling with words that seemed too large and too fragile for the space between them. "You've given us back something I didn't even realize we'd lost." "And what's that?" Eliza asked, hardly daring to breathe. "Joy," he said simply. "The simple pleasure of being alive in this moment, in this house, with people who care about each other. I thought that died with Rebecca, but you've shown me that it was just sleeping, waiting for the right voice to wake it up." Lucy looked back and forth between them with the sharp awareness of a child who senses that something important is happening. "Does this mean Eliza is really our family now?" she asked. "Not just pretend family, but real family like Mama was?" Samuel's eyes never left Eliza's face as he answered. "If she'll have us," he said. "Not as a business arrangement or a matter of convenience, but as a husband who has finally remembered how to love, and a father who wants to give his daughter the best possible life." The words hung in the air like a promise waiting to be claimed. Eliza felt tears spilling down her cheeks as she reached out to take his hand, marveling at the calloused strength of his fingers as they intertwined with hers. "I never expected to find love when I answered your advertisement," she said. "I was just trying to survive, to find a place where I could belong. But somewhere in these weeks of learning to be a wife and a mother, I discovered that I had fallen completely and irrevocably in love with both of you." Samuel's face broke into the first genuine smile she had seen from him, transforming his features from handsome to radiant. He leaned down to kiss her then, soft and sweet and full of promises for the future, while Lucy clapped her hands in delight and declared that this was the best day of her entire life. Later that evening, after Lucy had been tucked into bed with extra songs and stories, Samuel and Eliza sat together on the front porch, watching the stars emerge over the vast Texas sky. His arm was around her shoulders, her head resting against his chest, and for the first time since arriving at the ranch, she felt truly and completely at home. "Rebecca would have liked you," Samuel said quietly. "She always said that the heart has room for more love than we think possible, not less. I just forgot how to believe that for a while. I'm not trying to replace her," Eliza said. "I couldn't even if I wanted to. But maybe I can honor her memory by helping to keep the music alive in this house." "The music," Samuel agreed, pressing a kiss to the top of her head, "and so much more." In the months that followed, the Whitlock Ranch became known throughout the county for its warmth and hospitality. Neighbors would stop by on Sunday afternoons to hear Eliza play the piano and sing, bringing their own children to learn songs alongside Lucy, who had indeed proven to have inherited her mother's musical gifts. Samuel's smile became a common sight, and visitors often remarked on how much lighter he seemed, how the grief that had once weighed him down had been transformed into something more beautiful, a deep gratitude for love found twice in one lifetime. And in the evenings, when the day's work was done and the house settled into peaceful quiet, the three of them would gather around the piano, while Eliza's voice filled the rooms with melodies both old and new, weaving together the threads of past and present into a future bright with possibility and rich with love. The end.